We would like to take a moment to honor the Indigenous peoples who were dispossessed of their traditional lands by the legal doctrines of discovery and conquest. The University of Cincinnati, as part of the Greater Cincinnati area, was built on the native homelands of the Indigenous Algonquin-speaking tribes, including the Delaware, Miami, and Shawnee tribes. We are honored and grateful to be here today, albeit virtually, on their traditional lands. Good morning. I'm Professor Kristen Cowsum, co-director of the Nathaniel R. Jones Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice, and along with my co-director, Emily Ho, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Jones Center to today's inaugural Morelli Colloquy. This is an event which is going to be the first of many events, thanks to the generosity of Bill Morelli. Because the driving principle behind this gift was to open dialogue, communicate across difference, and increase understanding, all of this as a way to work towards addressing systemic inequalities. We have structured this first event as a conversation. And so throughout the day, we hope to have conversations among our very gifted and talented panelists that we have brought together for this, with the participants and the panelists, the different speakers, and also across disciplines. And because this is a interdisciplinary conference, we have had the pleasure of working to put this conference together with our friend and colleague, who is director of the European Studies program, Dr. Sunny Rucker-Chang.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to take a very brief moment just to say welcome on behalf of the European Studies program, which is an interdisciplinary program in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. It has been a great joy working with Professors Cowsum and Ho and their administrative staff to realize what we will be doing today. I look forward to learning from all of the participants, and thank you all for joining us.
Emily, you're muted.
Great way to get started. Hi, I'm Emily Ho, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Nathaniel R. Jones Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice here at Cincinnati Law. And before we move ahead, I did actually want to give some special big thanks to the people behind the curtain, the Zoom curtain, who have made this possible. So we'd like to thank the Jones Center's excellent executive assistant, Kathleen Cardwell, who is making sure everything is running smoothly here, and our excellent, awesome student program assistant, Ben Rands, who is graduating very soon. They put in so much work over the course of this year and put up with a lot of craziness, and so we really thank them. We wish we were in person so we could give them big hugs and thank you so much. And so I think it's going to be a great day, and I am going to finally hand it over to our Cincinnati Law Dean, Verna Williams, who is also a co-founder of the Jones Center. Verna?
Thank you, Emily. And good morning or good afternoon or greetings wherever you are. I'm Verna Williams, and I'm the Dean of the College of Law, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to our inaugural Morelli Colloquy. As a co-founder and former co-director of the Jones Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice, I'm also very proud to stand before you, albeit virtually, to witness the growth of this enterprise. With its roots in the nation's first joint degree program in law and women's studies, the Jones Center has transformed from a loose collection of courses into an institution that's garnered recognition here and abroad for bridging theory and practice, forging relationships, and of course, preparing students to be leaders in seeking justice. Today's colloquy is another milestone. Consistent with its interdisciplinary, intersectional, and collaborative ethos, the Center has refashioned the legal academic convening, inviting us to engage in a conversation that crosses boundaries and disciplines with the purpose of discerning how concepts of belonging and difference might be deployed to dismantle intransigent inequalities. This new chapter for the Jones Center is made possible, as you heard, by Cincinnati Law alumnus Bill Morelli, a longtime supporter of the College of Law and a mentor and friend to me. Thank you, Bill. Your generous spirit has enabled my colleagues to bring to life an idea hatched over lunch at the Gaslight Bar and Grill in the pre-pandemic era. Many thanks as well to my friends and colleagues, Emily Ho, Kristen Kalsum, and Sunny Rucker-Chang, whom you just met, the co-directors of the Jones Center and the organizers of this colloquy. The college benefits in innumerable ways from the Nathaniel Jones Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice. And with that, I will thank you, presenters and attendees, for joining us on this historic day. Let's get this conversation started.
Is everyone able to see the schedule? I apologize.
We can only see it through the break.
Okay. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started with our keynote conversation. And I will go ahead and share a slide to show you who our participants.
You're muted, Sunny.
I do that so automatically, I apologize. So joining us today for our opening keynote conversation is Dr. Tiffany N. Florvil, who is an associate professor of history at the University of New Mexico at the Colleges of Arts and Sciences, and Natsu Saito, distinguished university professor and professor of law at Georgia State University College of Law. I will be a second. So Natsu and Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing this conversation. So I have a question to start this out for both of you. In terms of your academic disciplines, what kinds of things come to mind when you consider the ideas of belonging and difference? Are these two concepts ones that are theorized or understood in your particular ways, in any particular ways in your fields?
I guess we don't have an order here.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. So
Tiffany.
I defer to, okay, I'll go first then.
Go, you go.
I think it depends. I think in terms of scholars of European history, they've long, particularly scholars who are looking at racialized minorities in the European context, they've long been really pushed by questions of difference and belonging and different processes of racialization from the Middle Ages to the present. But certainly as a larger field, I think you also see it in US history in terms of thinking about enslavement and colonialism, as well as in Caribbean history. But since I'm a Europeanist, I really do think that it's important that these scholars are really sort of showing you this longer lineage of racialization, especially when we look to sort of the medieval period. Oftentimes we think about the emergence of the rise of scientific racism in the 19th century, and that really sort of ignores earlier instances and practices of exclusion, which are premised on this idea of like whiteness as an organizing characteristic. So I think in terms of my area, yes, but certainly not all Europeanists are about these ideas of sort of belonging and difference and identity more broadly.
Yes, and that's certainly true in law as well. So I also want to say thank you for inviting us and for allowing this conversation. I think it's a really great way of framing some really important concepts and stepping back and allowing us to think a little more broadly than we usually do. I think that, well, I wanted to start by saying that I'm coming to you today from Tucson, Arizona, on lands of the Ohlone people. And I appreciated the land acknowledgement that we began this with. I think it's really important for us to think about where we are, literally, like to be grounded and to think about where we are, because it's just important. But also in this context, it really frames the question well, I think, right? Whose land is this? Who belongs? Who gets to decide who belongs? What? Who's different, and who decides the implications of difference? And for me, everything about the law implicates issues of belonging and difference. And often we see these as sort of opposites. You know, it's kind of like, not just in the law, right? From like Sesame Street, if you remember, I think they may have changed this by now, but right, when it used to be that, you know, which of these things are the same and which of these things does not belong here. And so we think of them as being constructed almost oppositionally or generally oppositionally. And that reflects a lot about the worldviews that underlie our disciplines, I think. I expect it's true for you, Tiffany. I know it's true in the law. And, you know, we come out of a very Western sort of Eurocentric understanding that constructs things linearly and hierarchically. It breaks groups and peoples apart, right? It starts out with this construction of people are separate from animals and animals from the rest of nature, and there's a hierarchy there. And once you set up that hierarchy, it's easy to say, well, there's hierarchies within people as well. And the sort of the goal there is we're all moving progressively towards some kind of sameness, some kind of universal ideal. Whereas a lot of peoples, and certainly the peoples whose land we're on, have tended to see things in a much more organic, unified way, in which not only are we all related, but the goal is balance, and balance requires difference. So difference is a good thing, right? Like belonging and difference come together instead of being oppositional. So I really, you know, like, as I said, I really appreciate the chance to think about these concepts. And certainly in the law, we start with the construction of difference, right? We use the law to construct race, and then we use race to divide people and then to emphasize their differences. It's foundational to colonialism, right? Anthony Angie has done great work on how the dynamic of difference, which is generally racialized, right, is essential to maintaining colonial relations. It's also true in settler colonial regimes like we live in here. And that kind of racialization and that construction of difference underlies all of our most basic concepts. And so I don't want to go on and on, but you know, just the land acknowledgement talked about the doctrine of discovery and conquest, right? And if we think about in law, we trace so much back to Johnson versus McIntosh in US law, and its construction of property, its decision of who owns this land. And if you really, you know, read the opinion, what it's saying is that this land belongs to the settlers because it wasn't property when indigenous peoples owned it. It wasn't property that was ownable and alienable until white people came along, right? And so from the very beginning, we have racialized difference embodied in the very notion of what is land, real property, and of course, in terms of what is how human beings are seen, whether human beings are seen as persons or property, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, it permeates everything, I think, about the law.
Thank you so much for those answers. So I will turn to specific questions now. Tiffany, congratulations on your recent publication of the book, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women in the Making of a Transnational Movement, which was recognized by the AAIHS as a Best Black History Book of 2020. Congratulations on that front as well. Your scholarship and work on social movements, gender and sexuality, emotions in the African diaspora in Europe, and particularly in Germany, have contributed greatly to the studies of Black and African diaspora, Black internationalism, Black feminist theory and politics, and Black intellectualism. Could you talk a bit about how the ideas of belonging and difference figure into your own work on any or all of these topics?
Hey, thank you. That's a really good question. I also want to thank everyone for inviting me and for the opportunity to be here today. I was so nervous that I was like, let me start. So I wanted to sort of say that. So yes, I think my work is all about difference and belonging in interesting ways. So I study a group of individuals who are sort of Black Germans who were mobilizing because they were excluded and not really deemed the norm of German identity or what constitutes Germanness. And so they organize in the 1980s and 90s to really sort of create this sense of belonging for themselves. So they recognize that they can be a community even if they're excluded from the national polity. And I think that's important for them. And for this community, difference is a way of mobilizing. It's not seen as a deterrent. It's actually embraced. So they are sort of really embracing Audre Lorde, sort of this African-American, Afro-Caribbean woman, her mantra of connected differences, that they don't have to ignore their differences. They need to recognize their differences and use those differences creatively and constructively to try to instigate change in the German context. And so I think the larger book is about issues of belonging for these individuals and issues of difference that are sort of foregrounded in their sort of understanding of empowerment, their understanding of themselves, and their ability to forge connections with other people across the diaspora, across the African diaspora, but also other allies. So I think in this way, you see both difference and belonging as really constituting significant elements for Black German activists, who I really see as not only activists, but also intellectuals. So I talk about them as activist intellectuals. I also come up with this idea of quotidian intellectuals, in which they're everyday intellectuals, in which there's intellectualism in the everyday. And these individuals are really stressing that. And particularly they're stressing why racism is still so persistent in the German context. And this is really important in terms of thinking about Germany more broadly, because after post-1945, there's a sense of like, the Nazis are gone, we've purged racism from, we've purged it from our lexicon, we've purged it from the nation, so to speak. And the reality, it was far from that. That racism is still quite entrenched institutionally, as well as in the everyday. And so Black German activist intellectuals or quotidian intellectuals who I talk about really push these issues to the fore. They're pushing issues of German colonialism, which are premised on difference and exclusion. They're pushing issues of the persistence of racism, the treatment of migrants and refugees. They're pushing all of these ideas of how Germans construct difference and how the ideal German is really perceived to be white, and that Germany as a country, as a nation, is also very monoracial and monocultural. And so within this larger movement, they're really pushing that Germany's never been monocultural, monoracial. It's always been diverse. It's always been multicultural, multiracial, and that we need to sort of recognize why these organizing principles are really sort of helping to divide the country in ways that are very pernicious. And so I feel like the discussion about belonging and difference are so central to my work. I focus on them in so many aspects. I focus on how they forge, the sense of belonging with others outside the borders of Germany. So they're really keen on forging connections with others across the diaspora, other white allies. So I think in this case, for Black Germans and for my own work, belonging and difference are sort of very key concepts in how I see these communities mobilizing, becoming much more politicized, and using differences as a connecting module, really, as a mode for relationships and forging connections that are not necessarily ignoring those differences. So certainly your Black Germans are quite diverse in terms of their background. Some can have ancestry from the Americas or Latin America or Europe or the continent of Africa. And so that sort of notion of difference as an empowering tool for community is very, very important. I don't want to take up the whole time, but I'll kick it back over to you.
And I do, thank you so much, Tiffany. There's so much to unpack there and discuss, and hopefully we will have time to do that in the Q&A following once we get through but so much to talk about there. So thank you so much. And so I'd like to turn it over to Natsu. I have a specific question for you. Your work over the years has been impressively wide-ranging, focusing on, and I'm quoting here from your GSU web profile, American exceptionalism and international law, the legal history of race in the United States, the plenary power doctrine is applied to immigrants, American Indians, and U.S. territorial possessions, and the human rights implications of U.S. governmental policies, particularly with regard to the suppression of political dissent. Your latest book, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists, was published just last year, also in 2020. Could you talk about how belonging and difference figure into your own work or on any or all of these topics?
Sure. I think the framing of belonging and difference is a great way to sort of capture what I've been addressing in all of these dimensions of my work. Most recently in the book on settler colonialism, I'll just start there because it's hard to not to talk with some specificity. But that book was really driven by the question of the functions served by the construction of difference, right? Like there's lots of talk about eliminating racism and increasing recognition that we have systemic and structural racism in the United States. But I felt like we were always skipping a step, right? There's racism, it's bad, we need to get rid of it. But if we don't understand why it's there, I don't feel like we're going to be able to really get to the root causes and therefore to eliminate it. So I was trying to understand, how this difference is constructed and used with respect to the ways in which different peoples have been racialized. And for me, this is grossly overgeneralizing, but I think it's nonetheless important to think in terms of how different groups have been racialized in order to promote the needs and interests, the perceived needs anyway, of the colonizers of this land. And if you think in terms of European colonizers coming over here as settler colonists, right? They didn't come simply, simply is obviously the wrong word here, but in a classic colonial situation, we think of colonizers as coming to exploit land and resources and labor, and then going home. Here, they came to do all these things, but to stay. And so that meant that they had to, from their perspective, eliminate indigenous peoples. And that was physically, but it was also conceptually. So that even now, although there are lots of indigenous peoples here, often they're talked about in the past tense, right? Oh, American Indians used to, blah, blah, blah. And there's this real disappearance. And the way in which American Indians and other indigenous peoples under US jurisdiction have been racialized has been to promote that notion, to exclude, to put outside of the polity, right? They're savage, they're uncivilized, blah, blah. And to exclude them and then to sort of erase them from history. Whereas with respect to people of African descent, the explicit purpose for incorporating them, which is a kind of forced belonging, right, was to exploit their labor. And so they were racialized in some similar ways, right, as savage and uncivilized, and yet somewhat differently, right, more in terms of sort of animal strength and kept capable in certain ways, but not ways that involve intellect and sort of more sophisticated human characteristics or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So my point is that we've been racialized in different ways to serve different purposes. And then the ways in which we've been racialized are used to further those purposes, so that even now we see, for example, with the ways in which people of Latin American or Mexican descent or Asians have been historically desired for labor, but for disposable labor, right? They've been those who benefit from their labor have wanted them to be available to work cheaply, but also to be able to get rid of them. And that underlies a lot of our immigration policies. And that again implicates the ways in which they've been racialized and the ways in which they've been legally classified so as to not share the purported benefits of full citizenship and incorporation. And so a lot of my work has really sort of tried to unpack the why of the specific ways in which difference has been constructed. And I think that goes for race and racism. I think it also goes for xenophobia and the ways in which xenophobia, which I see as intimately related to racism and certainly overlapping with racism in many ways, but nonetheless distinct in certain ways, and how racialization and xenophobia they emphasize particular differences or construct particular differences and then use them to decide in any given situation who belongs and who doesn't. And it's a very fluid thing. I think that's also really important, is that a lot of the ways in which these characterizations exist are constructed to be fluid, right? So that, for example, the model minority myth can be a way of saying, oh, look, Asians have all these positive characteristics. And then that's used in turn to further consolidate racial hierarchy and to divide people of color amongst themselves. But it's also, all of those characteristics can be flipped, right? People who are hardworking are all of a sudden the people who are taking jobs away and who work for less than livable wages. And people who are family values oriented are all of a sudden clannish and exclusive and all those things. And so depending on whether the desire is to, at the moment, include or exclude, those characteristics can be turned around and used for those various purposes. So, it's just a very rich field to be looking at, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natsu. And as you were speaking and thinking about a tie to what you and Tiffany both were saying, thinking about this idea of race not being one thing and being fluid and being mutable and being able to be used to the benefit of whoever is sort of setting the terms of those racial hierarchies is something that I see happen as being valid for both of your work, both yours and Tiffany's. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that toward the end of this. So do you have a follow-up question for both of you? So has belonging and difference or difference played a role in the recent rise of nationalist and or fascist movements in Europe, the US, and the world more generally? If so, how can we prevent the inevitable drawing of false equivalencies between difference and belonging, or difference or belonging in these different contexts? And I think this is a question obviously for both of you, and you can, if Tiffany, you would like to start, that'd be great.
Okay, that's also a really good question. I think the rise in fascism and these ethno-nationalist movements are also tied to a notion of belonging. The problem is that they don't feel like they belong. Their world is now disappearing because of those others, those presumed and imposed, this sort of imposed notion of otherness on those racialized communities. So I do see that these sort of nationalist white supremacist groups, especially in the US, as well as, in other regions like Italy or Britain or Hungary, quite honestly, are driven by this notion of needing a sort of a purging of the country from these sort of others, and really reinstating this notion of what belonging means for them. And it's also premised on this notion of whiteness again, that like whiteness, even, and it's also a little bit tricky because I mentioned Hungary, but I think there's a principle about European identity in which whiteness is the principle that helps everyone sort of reconfigure who they are or reconfigure who they're not supposed to be. And I see these movements as really sort of espousing ideas about belonging, but it's also premised on excluding and noting the differences that are inherent in the society that they think shouldn't be there. And so this is also common in terms of thinking about Alternative for Germany, the sort of alt-right political group in which they claim, and Pediga also, they claim that Germany is, becoming there's an Islamization of Germany. And so it's dealing too much with people who are of Muslim descent, and it's sort of ruining the German nation. And they need to sort of respond accordingly. So their notion of belonging is also premised on a notion of exclusion, which I think is counter to some of these other movements who are sort of fighting against that type of belonging and exclusion. And then I think in terms of these sort of wider sort of movements, we see this also in Brazil. We see this with Bolsonaro, and how these ideas of belonging are reconfigured in particular moments of like, I think in particular moments of like discontent and tension that are emerging in these respective societies, where you see notions for belonging pushed by this sort of right-wing side. And countering that, you do have sort of leftists saying, pushing for notions of belonging in a different way that's premised on inclusivity. And I think that's what's so interesting about these sort of Black Lives Matter movements across the globe. It's premised on, look, colonialism existed. It still has the afterlives of colonialism and slavery are still so entrenched in society. We can't ignore them, but we need to sort of mobilize together to sort of talk about these issues and how these practices, these abilities to sort of really construct identities, exclude the individuals in a variety of polities are all tied back to sort of a colonial legacy of settler colonialism here in the US, of settler colonialism on a variety of continents, including Africa and Asia. So I think it's't that we have the counter, sort of this counter point to sort of this uptick in nationalists, ethno-nationalists, and right-wing politics, and you see also these discourses emerging with sort of the Brexit discussions in terms of thinking about this harkening back to an imperial age in which Britain was really a powerful imperial entity. And the loss of those territories and their ability to not maintain a sense of identity as a result of that, and the need to sort of like carve out a new sense of self as a result of those losses, which is still sort of premised on a variety of exclusions within this notion of belonging. So their notion of belonging, sort of thinking about right-wing, ethno-nationalist, populist movements, are all premised on a notion of belonging that is in which difference is undergirding their notion of belonging. We don't want to have those others here anymore. We need to sort of maintain our country for us, so to speak. And so I think that's really been an interesting thing, that like difference and belonging are also key to those movements and those discourses, albeit in certainly different ways.
Yes, and Tiffany, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the idea of post-colonial melancholia as yes, playing a role here, and how that really feeds back into the sense of loss. And then thinking about maybe how we might be able to connect metropole, post-colonial space, settler colonial societies within this conversation, right? Which is exactly what we're doing here. And so then with that, I will turn this over to you, Natsu.
I really appreciate those insights, Tiffany, because it's great for us. I think so often in the US, we tend to think just inside the US box. And it's really helpful to get a sense of how these movements are playing out across the globe. And I really like how you framed it in terms of those movements being based on insecurity and fear, and the need to create sort of an identity that somehow allows people to feel better about themselves, apparently, and superior, and how that's really tied to colonialism, because the problem, of course, or one of the many problems with these relationships that have emerged from colonialism is that the colonizers have created their identity, like you were saying about Britain, right? They've identified themselves in terms of their colonial positions. And as they see the loss of that hierarchical superiority, they don't know how else to define themselves. That's certainly, something I've encountered whenever I raise issues of Indigenous land rights here. Is like people tend to go, but I can't even think about that, right? They're willing to think about racial equality, but they're not willing to think about Indigenous rights because they're like, where do I go? I don't have anywhere else to go. I can't leave. I'm like, nobody asked you to leave, right? It's just think about where we are and whose land it is and who has, the legitimate right to be here and to be involved in the decisions about it. But people just can't go there because their identity is so constructed in terms of these colonial possessive relationships that they've constructed. And I think that one of the things that we really have to be careful about when we address these issues in terms of, the problems with nationalism, which often really we're talking about white supremacy here, and fascism, is that there's a danger, I think, that we will sort of move very automatically into belonging. Well, everybody should belong. And of course, everybody should belong at one level, right? But the question is, what should everybody belong to? And should everybody belong to a colonial enterprise? And if that's where we're going, that's really problematic, right? Because it's still colonial. And having sort of kinder, gentler, more inclusive colonial relationships is not going to solve the problem here. And so I think that we need to appreciate difference and think about the ways in which we can construct societies and civil society and states, or hopefully alternatives to states, that actually appreciate and incorporate difference. There's a sort of there's an interesting piece by Kim and Sundstrom that's addressing xenophobia, and they use what they call a caricature, but they have they were talking, this was shortly after those sort of white supremacist rallies with the tiki torches and all of that, right? And they were talking about how they were advocating one blood, right? And the whole sort of one blood, one soil, one mind, whatever are those, that obviously harken back to the Nazis. But what they pointed out, which I thought was really useful, was the notion that those racialized supremacists are talking about one blood, right? If you don't have our blood, you don't, you're not as worthy. But how the one mind side of it can incorporate and accommodate a very assimilationist perspective. And so that there's this whole sort of movement towards inclusivity and expanding belonging that's also very problematic, because it's saying, oh, of course you can come in, right? Of course you can be part of us, even if you're racially or ethnically or national origin related different, but you just have to join our mind, right? You have to join our culture, speak our language, become part of this polity, and we will welcome you. And that, means, right, if you want to belong, you have to give up who you are. You have to give up your identity, your culture, your history, your heritage, and ultimately that's very genocidal, because that's the definition of genocide, right? That, actions taken with the intent to destroy groups as such, as national, racial, ethnic, religious groups as such. And so, the people can survive, but if they don't have their identity anymore, they've really lost that incredibly valuable difference. And so I think that as we think about these movements, we have to appreciate that there's nothing wrong with the idea of identity and people and nationhood. It's just that we don't have to interpret it the way we have in the context of colonial relations.
you for that. Those very insightful comments, and it seems through your thoughts, it's a re-articulation and reformulation with the lands that we live on, a re-articulation, reformation with the way that we see ourselves in relation to each other, and expanding the notion of belonging, right, as it persists right now. And so I'd like to move on to sort of a bit more general questions, because this is an interdisciplinary conference, and I know that lots of people are here who are engaged in interdisciplinarity, and your research and scholarship are great examples of this. So I'd like to ask you, if both of you could address or talk a little bit about your experiences in conducting interdisciplinary scholarship. What are the benefits and what are the challenges?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
I think that there have been, I mean, interdisciplinarity has been a foundation for me. I think, you know, I am a trained historian, but I really enjoy women and gender studies, and I use that literature, emotions, affect theory, as well as sort of African diaspora studies. So like, had I not had those other areas, I think I would have faltered a little, especially coming from the perspective as a Germanist. So I studied German history, modern German history, and it's a white field. And so, and that's, it's changing slowly, but I think turning outside of the field of Europe, looking at other scholars in the African diaspora, looking at other scholars in a variety of disciplines and subdisciplines that I just mentioned, really helped to ground me and made me feel that like the work was not insignificant. And so I jokingly said this to a grad student class that I visited last week, that, you know, when I went to my first German Studies Association conference, you know, back in the day, I'm not going to say the year, but I presented on my research on Black Germans, and I was like very excited. And one of the sort of questions that emerged was like, how many are they? Are they really important? And I was like, oh my God. And I mean, as a graduate student, I had no, you know, I wasn't really able to like answer that. And then after that, I sort of did some research and was like, 500,000, you know, anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000 people constitute Black Germans in the German context. And that's a similar number to that's a similar population to Jews before World War II. So like thinking about sort of the notion of like that quantity matters more. And so interdisciplinarity has really given me a sense of like, this work matters. It helps me challenge and push back against notions that racialized minorities like Black Germans or don't matter, that their presence is insignificant, that it's also just a 20th century dynamic or a moment. And so I think it's been really important to sort of engage with that scholarship, but also to engage with those scholars. So in many ways, those scholars and that work has given me life. It's just helped to sustain me in ways that have made this work feel grounded. And I mean, it's certainly not always easy, but I think I've enjoyed it tremendously, and I've gained a lot. I've learned about a lot about myself through the process, as well as sort of studying. For me, it's been really important to study how, as Natsu mentioned, how difference is constructed across a variety of times and spaces, and why that's important. And that keeps coming back in I'm teaching a Black Lives Matter and Global Perspective class this semester, and that keeps coming back. And my students are like, it's like that Geraldine Hang reading that you gave us, Dr. Florvil, about the medieval period. And I'm like, yes, race was invented. Yes. And so it keeps coming back. My students are like, yeah, and we see how race has been constructed differently across these different geographical spaces, and how it's been tied and affixed to the skin, to religion, to a variety of other sort of very, you know, not static, but also static presumptions, depending on who's doing the constructing. So I think for me, I can't not be an interdisciplinary scholar. I think I'll probably just continue to be an interdisciplinary scholar until the day I die. I'm not trying to, I think it's important to really expand my, my theoretical breadth, and interdisciplinarity allows me to do that.
I feel that way too. Like it's what keeps me sane, because it brings us into contact with other people, other ways of thinking about things, other languages, other resources and sources. Our disciplines are really siloed and divided, and each one has language and its own little bars for admission. And I don't think that's really an accident, right? Like they're trying to keep us separate. They're trying to create these little, jump through these hoops to win your gold stars systems within each of the separate disciplines, and they're very different. And, one could think that they were designed to keep us from being able to talk to each other. And I think it's really helpful just to get out into other areas and to think about what are our common languages here and the common problems that we're addressing, and how the frameworks and analyses that we've been developing in each of our areas can contribute to the other discipline. And to do that, we have to step out of our silos and the way in which we speak, or the things that we consider to be most important. I'm also an affiliate faculty member with African American Studies at Georgia State, and it's just such a, like you said, like a breath of fresh air, right? Just to be able to be in a different space with people who think all the time about the issues that I think about all the time, but very few of my legal colleagues think about all the time. And so that's been wonderful. And also just late in life, I've come to appreciate how much I can learn from just all sorts of different disciplines, right? From education and geography and history and all these different areas. It's just really useful, and I think helps sort of the common denominators come up to the surface. And I think that that's what's important, because ultimately we shouldn't be talking not only just to ourselves, but to other academics, right? If we're not doing something that's actually useful to real people, then, we're just privileged, isolated people talking to ourselves. And so I think it's the interdisciplinarity that helps us get into spaces where we can understand what will actually be useful out in the world.
Can I also add something? Sorry.
Of course, please.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you triggered something when you were talking, Natsu, that I think there's something about a sense of belonging for me in terms of interdisciplinarity, that like my differences in terms of as a scholar and my own positionality, I feel validated, with my connections in historical geography or history or anthropology or, sociology. Those are spaces that see me and my work as being, is not being insignificant or is dismissed. And so in many ways, the work that I'm doing, because I love collaboration with people in a variety of other disciplines. I like trying to foster transatlantic connections as much as I can. And I think part of that is also just trying to create these networks of belonging in which we don't feel so siloed and excluded. Trying to create more opportunities for the type of work that I want to help others produce, especially when I think about like Black European history and studies more broadly, is that like creating spaces and networks so that we feel more connected to each other, that there's a sense of belonging. So in my work, but then also in the work that I do outside of that work, but still connected to that work. So yeah, I think it's like layers of belonging in terms of seeing and how we've been constructed as different scholars, as lacking expertise, that our work is not as rigorous. I mean, these are sometimes the common refrains that I hear at a variety of, prominent conferences about some of the work that I do and some of the work that my colleagues do, so that we're challenging those notions of that we don't belong. We do belong, and we're creating our own paths. And I think that's important too. Okay, sorry, that was a long-winded.
Yeah. No, that's such an important point. And you reminded me in talking about that, like how much I've learned when I've sort of gone out of the box because, for example, the work on plenary power, I mean, this is like disciplines within law, but I had worked on immigration and I saw that plenary power was a foundational doctrine. And then I did work in federal Indian law and I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is the same doctrine. And then I started looking at, US law governing colonies like Puerto Rico. And it's like, wait, they're saying the exact same thing with the same doctrine. But at that time, nobody was talking about the relationships. And, everybody was just in their little box talking about this legal doctrine that just happened to be the same legal doctrine across those disciplines. And then as I started to think about it, was, created by the same Supreme Court that came up with Plessy versus Ferguson and, all of that sort of reaction to Reconstruction era stuff. And it was like, oh, there's so many things that explain so much richness here in terms of what's going on. But if you didn't step outside, go outside the box, whatever particular box it was, you'd never see those connections.
Oh, and I think that this ties into something that one of the first things that you said, Tiffany, was this idea of the quotidian historian or the activist intellectual, right? And thinking about our sources of knowledge production, and maybe even expanding our notion of what interdisciplinarity means, right? And taking it even outside of the academy, which is something that I hear both of you saying, right? So sort of raising the bar or thinking even more broadly about the concepts. This is wonderful. I just wanted to say very quickly before moving on to this next question, if anyone has any questions for our panelists, please do not hesitate to write them in the Q&A and we will get to them in just a few minutes. And so my last question here that I'd like to ask to both of you, of course, is, and this goes along with interdisciplinarity, how should analyses incorporating belonging and difference interact with intersectionality theory?
Go for it.
Okay. I think they already do. I think in terms of the work that both Natsu and I do, we are clearly intersectional. We're not only looking at race/ethnicity, but gender, class, sexuality. I know I'm looking at sexuality in my own work. And so all of those intersecting identities are not excluded in how we sort of see these communities that we study or see how differences are constructed. That like there's something to be said about how differences, plural, are constructed in a way to help maintain white supremacy and also maintain control in a variety of settings. People are always sort of like, why are you mentioning white supremacy in the German case? And I'm like, well, it's a super whiteness there. Like that's premised on an Aryan notion of who, on an Aryan identity, like a super kind of whiteness that, we saw the horrors of what that super whiteness was supposed to mean for the nation with the Third Reich and the genocidal practices. So I think it's central to the work that I do. It's central to the work that we should all be doing in terms of how we see people living and surviving. Like, I think that's the thing that like, we're talking about how difference is constructed and oftentimes or not, where I haven't been mentioning that like people are resisting, they're carving out spaces, they're doing it in a variety of ways that are very keenly aware of their intersecting identities and how one fight for liberation is a fight for all forms it's a fight against all forms of discrimination. And so I think I can't not do this work. It just doesn't seem possible, but I know people do. So like, and I say that as someone who's trying to sort of push some of that curricular change in my own department, on which, some of my colleagues need to potentially engage with more of these intersectional studies and that aren't centering on white male historians. Not to say that white male historians are horrible, but that there are also other types of intellectuals that can be given space. And I think that goes back to the quotidian intellectuals too, that like, we're not only looking at sources that are sanctioned by the academy, that we should also be looking at sources that these quotidian intellectuals are creating and producing as sites for knowledge production. So all of that knowledge production needs to be intersectional. And I feel like that's a key thing in my own pedagogy and in my own work. So and I say this in terms of like, I teach Western Civ, basically 1648, so Treaty of Westphalia to the present. And the class is all about gender, race, and class. So by the end of the semester, and I also throw in some, sexuality, some queerness. By the end of the semester, the students are like, we get it. Europe wasn't white, Dr. Florvil, we get it. Like, I get it. Thank you, stop. But I just want to stress that like, this is why this type of work matters, because students oftentimes are like, they see race as sort of just like, Black, POCs, or Indigenous, but they don't also see that whiteness is constructed, and that whiteness was consciously constructed in opposition to those other communities. And so that's a way of interrogating those is what I think intersectionality, interdisciplinarity allows us to do.
That's a great point. And I really love that last point you made about the construction of whiteness and, how Europeans were turned into white people, right? Like, I feel like if we can't get back to that historical phenomena, then we're never going to be able to really unpack whiteness. And white folks aren't going to be able to find an identity that's not based on colonial sort of relations. But getting back to the intersectionality question directly, I also, of course, think it's really key. And I think that looking at it through the lens of belonging and difference can be really helpful, because a lot of times we see intersectionality as different identities or different pieces of identity being cumulatively having a cumulative impact. And of course they do in a certain sense, but that approach is based on dividing stuff up to start with, right? And not sort of really coming at it from an appreciation of the organic interrelatedness of them, right? How gender is racialized and race is gendered, and all of those other ways in which these constructs don't exist independently. And I think that as we use this theory, we can sort of incorporate all of the sort of the organic interconnectedness. So it's not a choice really of, I think I'll be intersectional today, right? You can't talk about any of it without being intersectional, or you can't, sort of validly address any of these points, I think. And so it's, it's an important thing to keep in mind. And as you're pointing out, to help our students see, I think, because they're used to dividing things up into these little boxes.
Thank you. And we do have one question that has come in, but before we will get to that question, I wanted to make sure that to provide you both space to say any kind of closing comments that you might have.
All right. Okay.
I'm good. I just thank you for this opportunity to talk about all these things. And there's so many places we could take this. I think we should just see what the audience is interested in.
The same. I mean, I feel like I can talk to you all day, Natsu. So
I know.
I'm
we
glad
might have to continue after this.
I know. I feel like I'm so glad that we were able to connect, but I'm really excited to hear what the audience has to say.
And that was the purpose, is to put you all in dialogue with each other. So if and when the conversation continues, that's wonderful. So the first question that we have here is from Bill Morelli. This is for Professor Saito. The difference between settlers and colonists is fascinating. Was it always a foregone conclusion that initial settlers who came for religious freedom would turn into colonists? In the worst sense of the word, ? It seems that much of the worst aspect of colonial expansion came after the French, British, and Spanish began exploiting Native peoples through colonial Native military alliances to further their own geopolitical goals.
Okay, that's a great question. From my perspective, the settlers were colonists, but there are different types of colonists or colonizers. And as you point out, some of the early European colonizers in North America did not intend to stay. They intended to benefit from the resources and then to leave. But some of them, did intend to stay but weren't successful. And the ones that were successful obviously became the ones that we now refer to as settlers. But to me, they were always colonizers as well, because they were here to exploit the land and the resources and the labor of people here. The difference to me is that they intended to maintain it as a permanent state, right? There was no end to this form of colonization. There was no going home. There was no withdrawing. There was no, recognizing the independence of the peoples who had been colonized for these decades or centuries. It was a conversion into the settler colonizers' vision of a new type of society. And for them, the goal has been to normalize this, right? There is no, as some of the settler colonial theorists say, there's no end point to this, right? There's only such normalization that we lose sight of the fact that it is an ongoing colonial relationship. And therefore, if that's accomplished, decolonization is taken off the board. So I don't really, that doesn't mean that everybody who came here came intending to be a colonizer. Mahmoud Mamdani talks about the difference between colonizers and migrants, and he describes migrants as being, colonizers as people who come to set up their own society, to impose their own society on, whatever they find, whereas migrants come to join somebody else's society. Now, if it's a settler colonial society that they're joining, they may well become functional colonizers. And I think that that's also very important to remember. That's something that our Native Hawaiian brothers and sisters remind us about all the time, right? Like, we don't care how you got here. Right now, you are colonizers. But I do think that, that there can be very different, significant differences in motivation and in the way in which people came and the functions that they serve. So it doesn't mean that everyone is necessarily functioning as a colonizer, but to the extent that we are here on somebody else's land and taking advantage of it, we are benefiting from colonization and therefore functioning as colonizers in many respects, even if we're not in power.
Thank you, Natsu. We also have a question here from Professor Moore. 2 questions around research approaches in building co-learning communities. In addition to the important values of interdisciplinarity that you are helpfully highlighting, might framing the construction of belonging and difference as a wicked problem that requires 1, transdisciplinary development of new theoretical frameworks, and 2, participatory research that shifts power over the construction and use of knowledge. And I think that's something that both of you can answer if that is okay. Tiffany, do you mind taking that? And then Natsu, you could follow since you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it again, if it's okay. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this is why I'm driven to pursue lots of collaborations in an effort to try to see what kinds of new theoretical frameworks are useful. Not only through my research, but also thinking about it through my pedagogy. So for instance, the Black Lives Matter class that I'm teaching this semester, it's actually a transatlantic class. There's a colleague at the University of Cologne teaching a similar Black Lives Matter course on global perspectives. And last week was our first session together in which both of our students, both sets of students met. So I think there's a way of using this as a pedagogical tool to really reshape how students see power relations, constructions of difference and racialization, discourses of racelessness, which are very pervasive in Europe. Even though like race is hyper visible, it's also simultaneously hyper invisible in those settings. And so I think this class is a useful way of helping me not only reconfigure my my pedagogy, but also to reconfigure what my research can do and how it can sort of try to change ideas about Europe. And so I think I'm trying to do that now. I don't know how successful it is. I'll see after with the evaluations for my students if they thought this class sucked. But so far, they're, you know, students are frank, so I'll know how it works. But currently, it's really giving me. I mean, I've had them read, you know, theoretical texts, you know, like David Theo Goldberg. They're also reading, you know, historical texts from, you know, Robin Mitchell. I mean, so there's a wide array of materials that the students are reading. And the students in Cologne are also reading, you know, my work and some other students, other scholars' work. So I think it's useful to sort of see what pedagogical and transnational tools we can use to really help our students understand how power works, how belonging is negotiated, and then how identities, plural, are constructed and affirmed or negated depending on the context. So students so far have been saying that they see that. So I see this as a key step in my own sort of work. But certainly I agree that there's more to do. This is only one step.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, Janet, about the importance of transdisciplinarity. And it certainly applies to this question of belonging and difference, but I think it applies more broadly as well, because I think that that's where we need to be going with all of our work, is to try to understand these in a framework that's not bound by the constraints of each of our disciplines, and to foster research that works across these borders. And I really think that it's going to be up to senior scholars in particular to promote this, because within each of our disciplines, to belong, right, you have to work within the discipline, and you have to be judged by people whose whole career is based on the legitimacy of the discipline and its constraints and its language, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, for junior scholars to succeed, they have to play that game and tick all those boxes. And yet we see that just keeps us siloed and, you know, unable to access some of the riches that we would be able to access if we were talking across disciplines. And so I think we have to sort of create that space and have it be recognized as legitimate space in order to foster this kind of work among all scholars.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And as you were both talking, I thought particularly what Tiffany is saying about your transatlantic course, what possibilities we have in this moment because of Zoom, right? I think that we're all sort of have Zoom fatigue and we're just kind of over it. I mean, of course, we're talking across Zoom or by way of Zoom right now, but thinking about, you know, making lemonade out of lemons and being able to interact with and talk to people that maybe we would not have otherwise had the opportunity to talk to and learn from. Kristen, you have a question? Would you just like to unmute yourself, please?
I do. I'm just going to unmute myself. I'm going to use my whatever position as a co-host panelist. This has just been so excellent. I've written so many notes, so many ideas, but I just wanted to make a comment. Just even Tiffany, you talking about the course that you are teaching on Black Lives Matter just makes me think about the richness of interdisciplinarity, because if I was coming up with that class out of the law school, just the texts that I would bring into the class would be very different than yours. And I mean, you're not going to get off the day without sharing your syllabus with me, because I just think being able to talk across disciplines in this kind of way, as Natsu has said too, once you kind of learn the connections between another area, and then if you center that area in looking at it, it just can allow you to bring out so much more on a particular topic. So I'm just had to jump in and say how delighted I am with how this conversation is going already, and hope that other people are finding as many thought-provoking ideas as I am.
I'll gladly share my syllabus. Yeah, I'll share it with you, Kristen. Yeah, I'll share it with you guys. I'm also teaching a grad section of this class. So technically, I'm teaching like a global 1960s class, grad class, this Black Lives Matter class, which is a new prep, and the grad component of this class. So I can share the grad component and the undergrad component for the class with you guys.
And Emily, if you don't mind just unmuting yourself, please.
Thank you, Sunny. So I'm also taking my privilege as a co-host and panelist here. This was excellent. This was so great to listen to you. And I too took a lot of notes and actually was texting back and forth with Kristen. But, you know, a lot of this actually reminds me so much of you know, Edward Said's work in representing the intellectual, where he says, you know, we need to get away from the sort of the professionalization of the academy and aspire to be amateurs in order to do the work that intellectuals should do to sort of, you know, he talks about sort of taking risks, you know, coming out of your discipline to take risks to do exactly the kind of work you all are talking about. And it's just really exciting to listen to this conversation. And Sunny, you as well, your comments as well. So thank you.
Thank you all for, thank you for, Emily, do you have another question or? I assume not. Okay, so we will wrap up. We're actually at 10:15, which is perfect. And I just want to thank both Natsu, Tiffany, for this wonderful, incredibly enlightening conversation. And I know I've taken a lot of notes, I've learned a lot, and I look forward to the conversation continuing. So thank you so much. At this time, we are going to take a break and we will be back on at 10:30. So thanks you all, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be in conversation with the both of you. Enjoy your break, everyone.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. So it's 10:32, and so we're back from our break. And I'm Emily Ho, and before I start, I briefly introduce the panelists for the first morning session panel. I wanted to throw up this slide just to remind our attendees and participants about the things that are on the slide. So we're being recorded. Remember to mute yourself, please. When it's Q&A time, or even before it's Q&A time, please send any questions you have for the panelists using the Q&A feature. And then we do have a survey that will ask you to fill out at the very end of as you leave the webinar. So with that, I am going to switch my screen over to share our panelists information. So give me 1 second here. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slide with our panelists' names and titles on them. And I wanted to introduce them very briefly. So the order that they're on the slide is alphabetical, but they won't necessarily be speaking in that order. So I'm really pleased to welcome 3 outstanding scholars and professors to to speak to you on our first panel. Professor and Dr. Janine Bell is the Richard S. Melvin Professor of Law at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law in Bloomington, Indiana. And she studies and writes on so many things, hate crimes, policing, racial profiling and policing, very, very important topics, especially right now. Dr. Manuela Boatka is, let me make sure I've got I'm sorry about this. I'm sorry. Dr. Manuela Boaca is joining us actually from Germany, so it is the afternoon there, and she is a professor of sociology at the Albert Ludwig University of Freiburg Institute for Sociology. And I speak no German at all, so I hope I didn't terribly butcher any of those. And she is, her work deals with world systems analysis, post-colonial, decolonial perspectives, gender in modernity and coloniality, and geopolitics of knowledge in Eastern Europe and Latin America. And then Matthew L.M. Fletcher is a professor of law and director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center at Michigan State University College of Law, where I think what he works on is fairly obvious from his title. And if you would like to see more detailed information about any of our panelists, actually, you can find it on our URL, which is at the bottom of the slide in the left-hand corner there. So I think we're going to start with Dr. Boaca, and then I'm not sure who's going to go. I think maybe Professor Bell will go after that, and then Professor Fletcher. So each of the panelists will speak for between 15 to 20 minutes so that we can have plenty of Q&A at the end. And like all moderators do, I will be keeping track of time, and I will remind you panelists via the chat function of the time. So let's get started. Manuela? Oh, here, let me stop sharing my screen, sorry.
That's what I thought too. Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you for inviting me to this. Thank you, Sunny, and thank you to the Jones Center. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And indeed, that's one of the advantages of Zoom, because I think otherwise it would have been a difficult transatlantic and transdisciplinary conversation. I am a sociologist, as Emily has presented me, and I thought from the program that I would be bookended by two legal scholars, so that it would be kind of a sociological plus legal discussion, which it still might be, but the way it is, I'm going to start with my own kind of disciplinary mooring and my own amateur kind of engagement with other disciplines. So from sociology, I'm the kind of scholar that deals with the historical part of sociology, which is something that hasn't aged well in Germany, which already makes it interdisciplinary, but not very popular. At the same time, from a sociological perspective, or at least from the perspective of how one is deformed disciplinarily, when we hear about difference and belonging, the first conception or the first term that comes to mind is that of the social difference. So what I thought to be doing here was to guide you through some of my own kind of trajectory of finding a meaningful engagement within sociology, but from that within historical sociology, with the concept of social difference, and how that led me to something more than just social difference, namely colonial and imperial differences. Because some of the most well-known engagements with the production of social difference in sociology have had to do with how the figure of the stranger was produced, and that was Georg Simmel's very famous contribution, producing the citizen and the non-citizen as figures, and there's a host of literature on that, so the citizen as the foreigner and how that is being kind of legally codified, but also the production of the racialized other and the processes of exclusion that result from it. Within sociology, however, all of these have been dimensions of conceptualizing modernity. Sociology seeing itself as the discipline of modern societies, or as basically Western modern societies, and most of the time less explicitly as the discipline of white Western modern societies, but the whiteness wasn't very clear or very explicit, but it was very much there. So For most sociology, that means that the production of difference in modernity is seen to engender anomalies, ambivalence, and chaos. At the same time, if we enrich or maybe creolize sociological thought with decolonial and postcolonial perspectives, we see a different engagement that I'd like to see as the generation of alterity, of difference, as the basis for the underside of modernity, which is coloniality. So what I want to deal with here is the similarities and dissimilarities between these critiques. And I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you get to see what I see. Yes. So the title is Dissimilar Critiques, Differences of and in Modernity Coloniality. And one of the most prominent and more productive engagements with social difference that I've come across while trying to make sense of my own kind of navigating difference in Germany, because I'm a Romanian migrant living in Germany for the past 25 years. And I was making sense both of my belonging and of my kind of formation in this discipline of sociology, having studied something else before. I studied English and German philology. And one of the most productive engagements with kind of negotiating difference within sociology that I came across in the beginning was Zygmunt Bauman's understanding of how modernity produces ambivalence. And one of the most enlightening quotes from his book, Modernity and Ambivalence, for me was when he says, among the multitude of impossible tasks that modernity set itself and that made modernity into what it is, the task of order, more precisely and most importantly of order as a task, stands out as the least possible among the impossible and the least disposable amongst the indispensable. So it's the archetype for all other tasks, one that renders all other tasks mere metaphors of itself. The production of order is the opposite of chaos. Chaos is what is not orderly. Order and chaos for Bauman are modern twins. And he conceptualized that against the background of his analysis of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and how the production of order in modernity not only is meant as the opposite of chaos, but is meant as the kind of dealing away or doing away with the waste of modernity that Bauman refers to. So he says, if modernity is about the production of order, then ambivalence is the waste of modernity. Being ambivalent in the context of production of order means that both order and ambivalence are products of modern practice. Both share the typical modern contingency. Ambivalence is arguably the most modern era's most genuine worry and concern. And basically, the failure of modernity is that the tidying up activity is construed as ambivalence. Now, that is one very kind of inner European continental understanding of how the production of difference has led to one of the most horrific kind of results, kind of culminating in the Holocaust, which Bauman has analyzed against the background of his own history and trajectory as a Polish Jew migrating to Britain, and then thinking about this history and through this sociological apparatus. If we turn our gaze to other understandings of modernity that start out as inter or even transdisciplinary, the more complex understandings of it I found to be in decolonial thought, and one that really reads as if it were a dialogue with Zygmunt Bauman is Colombian philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez's article, The Social Sciences, Epistemic Violence and the Problem of the Invention of the Other. We hear Santiago Castro Gomez does not deal with Bauman's work. He deals with how social sciences were very much involved in and responsible for the production of alterity. And he even says modernity is an alterity generating machine that in the name of reason and humanism excludes from its imaginary the hybridity, multiplicity, ambiguity, and contingency of different forms of life. And the current crisis of modernity is then seen by postmodern philosophy and cultural studies as a historic opportunity for these long repressed differences to emerge. So here we have a different starting point, both from a disciplinary understanding of how differences and ambivalences were, as Santiago Castro Gomez calls them, pathologies of westernization, not just a ahistorical production of order as against chaos, but a production of difference as pathological non-Westernness. And that is, of course, closely related and intimately related to colonialism, so that for Castro Gomez, this is the background against which the social sciences, including sociology, had emerged. So he's saying the social sciences legitimize the international division of labor and the inequality of the terms of interchange and commerce between the center and the periphery. That is, the enormous social and economic benefits that European powers obtained through domination of their colonies. The production of alterity within and the production of alterity without were part of the same construct of power. Coloniality of power and coloniality of knowledge were situated in the same genetic matrix. Well, genetic matrix is, of course, not meant biologically, but in this kind of understanding of how they were interrelated. I probably don't have to get into the definition of the term coloniality of power, but not to leave it aside, I'm just going to briefly go through the main features. So this is a term coined by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, who drew from and was himself part of the dependency theory tradition in Latin America, and then went on to work in world systems analysis and is one of the main proponents of decoloniality today. And Quijano defined coloniality as the political, economic, and sociocultural hierarchies between colonizers and colonized emerged with the conquest of the Americas in 1492. And at the same time as capitalist modernity's dark side. So that is something that other decolonial thinkers will put forward or will draw on in adding modernity / coloniality as a binary concept, or as an integrated concept in which the slash between modernity and coloniality, so to say the post-structural trick of the slash, indicates that these two are inextricable and kind of inseparable, so that coloniality emerged at the same time as modernity. It's called coloniality and not colonialism because it's different from pre-modern forms of colonial rule, in that coloniality translates the administrative hierarchies put in place by colonialism into a racial ethnic division of labor that outlives colonialism, so that racism and ethnic differences as kind of differences of pay, differences of employment, differences of social standing and legal standing are then continued into post-independence times, which makes coloniality more encompassing than modern European colonialism. These racial ethnic hierarchies and the international division of labor between centers and peripheries are transferred into post-independence times, so that administrative colonialism may be over, but coloniality is not. And to that, I think we need to add the fact that this is, of course, a landmark moment. 1492 is not only for theorists of decolonial thought or post-colonial theorists, some of them, the landmark moment, but also for an entire outlook on what the transatlantic European expansion pioneered in many ways. At the same time, we are reminded that 1492 was not just a one-directional movement. And some of the reminders, or the more powerful ones, had to do with the fact that the European colonial expansion and the production of difference that went hand in hand with colonialism in the Americas was predicated on and was continuing the production of difference within Europe that had taken place before 1492. And one of the more enlightening engagements with that comes from Ella Shohat, a post-colonial theorist and not a sociologist necessarily, but very much sociologically thinking, who in an article written in 1992, as a lot of celebrations and kind of commemorations of 500 years of Columbus's arrival in the Americas were taking place, wrote an article called Rethinking Jews and Muslims, Quincentennial Reflections, in which she reminded us that one of the reasons why Columbus sailed from a relatively unknown port of Palos in Spain to the Americas was that the bigger ports of Sevilla and Cadiz were clogged with fleeing Jews, because the moment of Columbus's transatlantic voyage and the impetus for finding riches for the Castilian crown was the fact that the Reconquista, the kind of Christian retaking of Muslim Granada, was part of a re-Christianization, of affirmation of Christianity in the Iberian Peninsula that went hand in hand with the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. So it was very much kind of not only predicated on that existing difference, religious difference as the marker and the basis for the possibility of colonization, but very much on the economic difference resulting from the confiscation of the wealth of the Jews expulsed from the Iberian Peninsula that then went into the resources for colonization. And that brings maybe the next point from the point of view of the colonizers and from the point of view of what that kind of difference that decolonial thinkers considered colonial difference did. And here, Sylvia Wynter, Cuban decolonial thinker, in another article written in 1992, the same occasion of centennial celebrations, she's saying the concept of man put forward in philosophy and social sciences after the European colonial expansion, or in the context of it, is not the equivalent of the human, so that the opposite of man, as with a capital M, is not woman. The other of man is basically the fact that the Judeo-Christian West represents the West, makes all others basically the deselected, the native peoples, the peoples of African descent were negatively marked in the process of colonization and in the process of enslavement as defective humans with the terms of man's self-conception. So the idea of religious difference transported from the still not colonizing Europe into the colonized Americas has to do with the translation of religious difference as just difference to a colonial difference that means dehumanization. So it is denial of humanity, it is denial of belonging to mankind, without mankind meaning man, but mankind meaning a certain type of ego, or a certain type of belonging in that sense. I know the time is short, and so I'm just going to add one other component to that to see how that played out in what I call a conquest modernity, not a modernity of production of order and of kind of opposite of chaos, but a conquest modernity that is producing first and foremost colonial and imperial differences. And that component would have to be the gender component, not because we just want to, or I would just want to nod to intersectionality, but because this was one of the other premises. The fact that at the same time as the European colonial expansion was happening, at the same time as the re-Christianization of Europe was increasingly being affirmed, the gradual criminalization of all forms of sexual independence for women was taking place, starting with contraception and abortion. And this has been explained a long time already by people like Carolyn Merchant and Maria Mies, and then by Silvia Federici, of course. But the kind of maybe metaphorical, symbolical, but maybe even landmark historical turning point of 1492 is also not only the moment Columbus arrives in America, not only the moment of expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, but also the moment that the first ordinance forbidding women under 50 to live alone and mandating that they instead go into service until they married was passed in Coventry, England, marking thus a trend that will be reinforced after 1550, when state policies were more specifically aimed at excluding women from skilled crafts, guilds, and high status occupations. So that by 1600, so in the long 16th century, the gradual banning of unmarried women and widows from most crafts and of all women from entering apprenticeships had limited employment opportunities for all of them. And then, of course, it is in that context where we have witchcraft as a crime against God, threat to Christianity, requiring state intervention and control. And one of the more recent, very recent actually, from March of this year, one of the articles that appeared in The Conversation was reminding us of how our imagery of the witch is actually related to the way women brewers were dressed and how they performed their kind of trade in the marketplace. Wearing a pointy hat was the possibility to be seen by those looking for women brewers, and the cauldron was the cauldron in which beer was brewed. So that the fact that women were less and less allowed to perform any kind of activities, including market activities, after the 16th century, is related to this imagery of the woman brewer whose main sin was that she was working. So she was in meaningful, gainful employment. This is all to say that a lot of the social differences that we work through today are not only historically entrenched, but that they're interlinked. And many of the ways in which we produce social and cultural difference today doesn't need to be reactualized or doesn't need to reinvent the wheel as the basis on which exclusion is taking place, but it just needs to accumulate and to hark back to existing meanings that then sound familiar to us. It sounds familiar that some are the others and some have always not belonged because of this historical entrenchment that harks back to colonialism. And this is just one fragment of a much longer history, of course, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. And wow, you are right on time. So I think we will move now to Janine Bell. I believe you've got slides too as well. Okay, so Janine, feel free to start whenever you're ready.
You seem to be nodding. All right. So high-profile police killings of African Americans like that of George Floyd tell us quite a lot about community and how it functions for police. Think about what we've learned about the community of police officers in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, just from the first few days of the Derek Chauvin trial. Derek Chauvin publicly used prohibited tactics to suffocate a man. His coworkers watched, and not only did they not intervene, they helped him resist bystanders and professionals' intervention. So the community and the police brotherhood enabled a public murder. That's quite significant. So the brotherhood and the thin blue line doesn't just prevent public intervention in fatal cases, it's also used to reinforce racial hierarchy. I first learned this more than 20 years ago when I spent time doing an ethnography of a police hate crime unit. The officers were investigating hate crime, mostly committed by whites against people of color. This particular unit I was in was hated by their fellow officers. And I remember one officer, this was a tough Irish cop, weeping when he described how much he was hated for protecting minorities. Not just by the white community. Of course, the white community didn't like the unit and was publicly critical of them in the nastiest way. But he was also hated by other police. And it wasn't so much the community hatred that affected him, but he was cut to the quick by the hatred of other police. This went against everything he believed as an officer. So though it's very tantalizing, I'm not going to talk about hate crimes, which I talk about on a daily basis these days, or about fatal cases. What I'm briefly going to talk about today is one of the more frequent interactions between police and citizens. I'm going to talk about police stops. Stops are really interesting because law enforcement officers are enforcing norms of racial hierarchy, both subtly and unambiguously. All right, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of what I'm talking about in the next few minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about racial discrimination in police practices nationwide. This is a quick snapshot of what the playing field is with respect to a very conservative estimate of racial discrimination. I'm going to then give you some insight into how the process of discrimination in police stops works. It's probably not the way you think. I'm going to talk about my research that sort of shows how this happens and the effect that this happens on people of color. And if there's time, I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy implications and solutions for this. All right. Our racial disparity in policing. There is police discrimination everywhere. And the most conservative estimate of police discrimination is Justice Department, is the US Justice Department. Since 2010, the Justice Department's pattern and practices investigations have found racial discrimination in police departments around the country. And I've highlighted just a few of these departments. Know that this is the most conservative estimate of racial discrimination in police department, scholars have said that the pattern and practices investigations are really just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm going to name some of these places because I want you to get a sense of the differences in the places. So East Haven, Connecticut, Beacon, New York, Orange County, Florida, Warren, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, New Orleans, Missoula, Montana, Seattle. And these are just, you know, this is the tip of the iceberg. There have also been sort of other scholars have found evidence of discrimination in police stops all over the country in really different types of places that range from places like Oakland, California, to places like Boston. And what's interesting about the discrimination in police practices is that it's in every type of department, established departments, urban departments, reform-oriented departments, committed to progressive policing. So I'm going to talk about discrimination in stops in one of these types of departments. And this is one of the most interesting studies of police behavior that's recently been published. All right, so one of the most, this was a study conducted by Chuck Epp, Stephen Maynard Mooney, and Donald Hyder Markell. And what they did is they surveyed more than 2,000 individuals in the Kansas City area about their interactions with the police. So Epp and his co-authors, in surveying all of these individuals, found that there are two types of stops. And this is a little bit confusing. There are traffic safety stops and there are investigatory stops. Both of these types of stops, you should know from a legal perspective, are acceptable. The Supreme Court has okayed both of them. They are both legal. With respect to traffic safety stops, these are stops made for traffic or safety reasons. They're the types of stops that people think should happen. The second types of stops are investigatory stops. These are stops made because the officer wishes to snip out the possibility of criminal behavior. All right. Now you're going to have you may have lots of questions about, you know, wait, was it an investigatory stop? In looking through all of these 2,000 stops, Epp and his co-authors come up with a clear distinction between these two types of stops, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. So analyzing several thousand stops by Black and white drivers, Epp and his co-authors found that depending on the type of stop, drivers reported being treated differently by race. They also interviewed people. So with respect to the traffic safety stops, African Americans were not more likely to be stopped. African Americans and white drivers reported the cop having the same sort of demeanor, and there weren't greater sanctions in traffic safety stops. In investigatory stops, African Americans were 2.7 times more likely to be stopped by white drivers. They were much more likely, African Americans, to describe the officer as impolite. This is where the rudeness came out when they were investigating you. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that the law enforcement officers were more suspicious of these people that they were stopping in the investigatory stops, they let most of them go without a ticket or warning, nothing. right? No impact. All right. So I was interested, following this research, I was interested quite broadly in how things like difference in stops affect the overall relationship between individuals of different backgrounds in the police. So between 2016 and 2018, my research assistants and I did interviews with Black, Latinx, Asian American, Indian, and white residents of Bloomington, Indiana. There was not only a diversity in race, you see it depicted here, sort of, this is more specific with respect to race, but there was a diversity in age as well. I interviewed, my research assistants interviewed people between ages 22 and 78. A few of the interviewees were students, some were faculty, some were staff. Back. No. You think that if I use Zoom all the time. All right. So some were faculty, some were staff. Most, though not all the respondents were connected with Indiana University. Also, interestingly enough, several were connected to law enforcement. 3 respondents had family members that were law enforcement, and 1 respondent supervised law enforcement officers. I was especially interested in the social class of respondents, and the vast majority of the respondents were employed. In some cases, they had quite a lot of privilege. Though the pilot for this research was designed to focus on Bloomington, Indiana, respondents reported their experiences in a variety of places, in a range of cities all over the United States. I'm not going to talk about this today, but I also did focus groups with several community members and with police officers wearing body cameras. And I went to 2 community police meetings. So in overall, there was in the sample, there was a diversity of feelings about and interactions with the police. Nevertheless, every non-white respondent I interviewed described personally experiencing an investigative stop. And I'm going to show you what these look like. All right, here is a Black man who describes a stop that he had several years before. The young man says that the officer walks back to the car and wants to know why my brother has a different name than me. You have this English name, he doesn't. The individual responds, our parents gave us different names. Are you sure that's it? The officer asks, are you sure you're not, Muslim? My brother, who was in law school, was incredulous. You can't ask me that. The officer, the individual said, the brother says to the officer, the cop's like, actually, I can. Here's another experience, this time by a Latina. She is talking about a drive in Indiana on a fairly deserted road late at night. She says, I'd made the drive a few times. I knew where to slow down. I get pulled over by a female sheriff. Her first question was, what are you doing and where are you going? She was looking in the back. Mind you, my parents are a lot darker than me, so she has her suspicions. I said, and I try to do this on purpose when I get pulled over, I try to sound as white as possible. We are coming from a church service and we are going home. She said, well, why is a church service so long? Where's home? How did you get here? Why are you driving so late? This is the treatment that minorities that I interviewed reported. These are fairly typical responses. I interviewed no individuals who had experienced any brutality, no one who was hit at all in the context of their stops. And what's interesting about this is that that it fits what happens in society in general and the picture that we have on social media. Whites are constructed by law enforcement as never suspicious, and Blacks and other people of color are constructed as always suspicious. So for instance, you see this on Twitter in the much discussed hashtag criming while white. So how does this affect, how do things like this affect minorities' feelings about police? So it really does. I mean, part of the reason the minority respondents found their behavior so humiliating is that they compared their treatment to that of whites. They know how whites are treated. They know about this hashtag. They are upset by it, and they'd like to do something about it. All right, how's this going to end? I think I see light here. I see a possibility of change, but that possibility is not going to happen by charging or by suing the police. I see that in how white respondents are starting to feel about the police. Several of my white respondents spoke of not trusting the police, and in some cases were frightened by officers who were visibly angry at them. My respondents described anger at being at odds with the police, and they were very upset that police were different than who they had previously understood officers to be. So my reading of several of these studies suggests that white mistrust of the police is growing. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this that you may have probably seen. Look at this. This is I-90, right? I-90 right out in the Bay Area. It's shut down. This is not just Black people and white counterculture police people. No. This is the Bay Area, right? And it's in the wake of Ferguson, right? This is not even this summer. So I think that whites are getting the message very much that police are not doing the protect and to serve, that individuals are not engaging in this behavior that they had expected them to. Almost every white respondent I interviewed had seen dash cam or other video footage of officers killing Blacks. And moreover, interestingly enough, they believe that officers can avoid loss of life, but they are choosing not to. Beliefs like this, I think, are becoming much more widespread. And, you know, fast forward to things like this summer, right? Defund the police. And this is what white respondents that were privileged said about the police. They The police need to treat Black people as they treat white people. There is no need for them to jump to conclusions and act crazy right off the bat. They are the ones who escalate the situation. From all the videos, I think they escalate it without due cause, and I think they bring all of this upon themselves, the cops. Here's another respondent, Bob. I think they get pissed off when they are talking to a Black person and the Black person is asking questions. Why do I have to do that? What have I done wrong? And that just pisses them off more. Bob says, I've never been treated like that. So you see increasing criticism of the police for their treatment of people of color. And this can have an effect on police. There's a possibility that this is going to have an effect on police behavior. And for minorities who feel targeted by police behavior and whites who are increasingly fearful of the police because of others' experience, I think that some sort of reform will be a welcome change. I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you, Janine. Two really interesting talks back to back. And, you know, as you were presenting, it just made me think that, you know, Janine, your presentation actually, you know, Manuela, when you talk about the underside of modernity as coloniality, this is sort of a picture of that, you know, a snapshot of that. It's really interesting. We will now move on to Matthew Fletcher. So Matt, you can start whenever you would like.
Thank you so much. It's a really great honor to be on this panel. I've known Janine and Emily as long as anybody I've known, other than relatives. So it's really great and a delight to have heard Manuela speak, which was learned a lot of really interesting, important points that I hadn't seen before. So I think, interestingly enough, my presentation is going to be a lot different and weirder than what you saw earlier, but it's going to tie things together a little bit. So I confess that I wasn't sure what to talk about. I'm used to speaking in front of people who know a little bit about Indian law or tribal law, or you know, lately I've been doing legal ethics, which is ironic and weird. But so now I want to talk a little bit about myself. I'm an Anishinaabe person, which is you know, part of a group of Indians in the Great Lakes region of the United States. You know, I come, and Janine and Emily know me well enough to know that I am a constant, you know, I try to push back on just about everything, even to the point of annoyance, I think. But my presentation will be sort of in comic book form. I'm not sure what ties it together. It's going to bounce back and forth, but I'll tell you there are two themes. One is the theme of talking. This is a colloquy. I don't know that I've ever been asked to participate in something called a colloquy. I know what a colloquy is. I looked it up on the internet and found out what a colloquy was. I also looked up on the Ojibwe dictionary what a word, and talked to a friend of mine, what a word in the Anishinaabe one could mean for colloquy. And we came up with gaganos, which is, you know, talking to each other. And the frame of my paper will be two things, my presentation. The first is the variations on the word talk in Anishinaabe, which is the language of the tribes that I belong to. It will also be about the past year or so of what I've been doing as a scholar and an advocate during the pandemic. And sitting in this chair, I mean, there's a bookshelf behind me that's out of place. It's in the dining room, but I've been sitting in this chair so long now, I kind of can't stand it. But this is what I do in this chair. So I make comic books, and let's begin. So let's start with just a tad of Anishinaabe political theory, which is my obsession for the past few years. You know, the easiest way to describe Anishinaabe political theory is to compare it to what I will call Chimukman political theory, which is the sort of the white guy theory of why we have a government. So as opposed to, and I'll get to this later, as opposed to Thomas Hobbes, who says we're all a bunch of incredibly violent, selfish, and competitive creatures who would kill each other unless somebody important and smart and powerful takes over our lives for us, we're all going to die. The Anishinaabe people believe the exact opposite, that humans are actually really quite unimportant in our universe, still have an important role to play, but that we're all designed and hardwired for harmony, for cooperation and respect for each other. And interestingly enough, I think enough cultural anthropologists will tell you that that's actually empirically verifiable, not the whole war against all kind of mentality. I think that's a fiction and a lie that has been perpetrated by the people that Manuela and Janine were just talking about going back centuries. Anishinaabe people will tell you that our role as humans is to be here as part of a greater thing, much bigger than we are. We're relatively small, whereas, you know, in the Bible, which is a tradition I grew up under, humans come last because they're most important. They own everything. They have dominion and name everything. We came last because we're the exact opposite. And other things are far more interesting and important to us. So I use the phrase, and I'm not going to try to pronounce very many of these words because I confess I'm not fluent in my own language, but this word at the bottom here is one of the variations on talking. He arrives. So that's our beginning. We'll start with this is actually, it looks like a sunrise, but my son Owen took this picture and edited it. It's a sunset, but pretend it's a sunrise. Okay. Here's the second one. This is pictures of me in 1976 or 7. I always forget which, with my parents, my mom on the top and my dad on the bottom. We went to a trip to through the Lower Peninsula, where I grew up, to the Upper Peninsula and into Canada, crossed over at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And I'm on a train there. It was my great moment as a child to get on a train. And I always wanted to be on a train. And, you know, that the bottom picture is me and my dad at Tequamanon Falls, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That trip is the trip where I don't have a lot of memories of this, but that's the trip when we crossed the border. The Border Patrol took us out of our car, asked my mother and interrogated her for quite a while about what she was doing with this child. Did she steal the child? Was it actually her child? And then when my dad began to object to it, they more or less arrested him. They searched our car, took it apart. By the way, it was like what we call a slug bug, one of those old VW bugs. They ripped out all the furniture looking for whatever it was, tore the whole thing apart, found nothing, let us go, and then ordered my dad to put the car back together so we could drive it away. And somehow, he's not a mechanic, he was able to do that. That is a pretty formative moment for me. So the reason my dad had already expressed an extreme hostility towards police and really any kind of governmental authority figure throughout his whole life, but this really cemented that. And my mother, of course, was more or less the same. I don't think anybody had ever treated her that badly before, but she is an Indigenous person and, we're subject to targeting. So I use the word here. This is one of the reasons I do these things. He talks for a reason. Next one is Crazy Talk. Another one of my projects in the summer of 2020 during the pandemic was to try to figure out, try to use my creativity, or if to the extent that I have it, to make what I call a plague journal. And so I used a comic book format that I'm using for you now. And this is just one of about 250 pages that I did. This is based on a news item that came out at the end of the middle of July after a big Supreme Court case in Indian law called Migrant versus Oklahoma. Usually Indian law cases don't make much mention of the news, but for some reason Ted Cruz decided to say this is the moment where the Supreme Court turned all of Oklahoma over to the Indians. Manhattan is next. Apparently he wasn't concerned about Texas. That's where he's from apparently, but turn Texas over to the Indians, who cares about that? But as long as Manhattan is protected, Ted Cruz will be happy. So I sort of made fun of all of this. And the word, my wife and I were laughing about this today when I looked up the word for he talks crazy. I think it actually is just gaga gibberish, gibberish as we say, gagadoon, which is sort of the root word of talk, and it's perfect. So that was one of my efforts at self-therapy during last year. Last year was a big summer for Indian country criminal justice. While all this stuff going on about defunding the police, and I got my Black Sabbath version of the Black Lives Matter t-shirt on today. There was something going on in Indian country having to do with the death penalty as well. Back in the 80s, when the Congress, early 80s and early 90s, when Congress was at the behest of the Department of Justice and the Reagan and Bush people were trying to expand the federal death penalty, and ultimately were able to do that under the Clinton administration of all places. Somebody pointed out that the only people on death row in the United States, federal death row, were Indians. And that has to do with the United States' unique obligations and also colonial aspirations for Indian country. The federal government has exclusive control authority over Indian country felonies. And so if you're going to have, murder and any other aggravated serious crimes of people on death row back in those days, it would definitely be Indians or, I don't know, crazy people rampaging through Yellowstone National Park. Military guys, they're the only ones that would be subject to the death penalty. It was mostly Indians. They stopped doing that a long time ago. And the feds really put an informal moratorium on things. And then 9/11 happened. So they killed a bunch of people then, but then they stopped doing that right away. And this guy from Navajo, his name was Mitchell, was put on death row, not because he was a terrorist, but in 2001 or 2002, but because he happened to be prosecuted by the feds at a time when they were interested in killing as many people as possible. So he got on death row then. And it wasn't really going to go anywhere because, they kind of did another one of those informal moratoriums, and nobody had been killed for a long time until the previous administration decided it would be an interesting electoral tool to start killing people again. America loves it when we kill people. And so this guy ended up being killed. And one of my former students and current colleagues Tamara Begay helped me write, who had written on this case years earlier as a student, helped me write a short paper for the Atlantic on this. So this is me in an area of law that I have no knowledge about whatsoever, which is the death penalty, talking continually. The next one is I'm being a little bit facetious because here we are talking flirtatiously. A few years back, the 10th Circuit, in a case involving tribal court jurisdiction over non-members, which is one of the things that I write about pretty extensively, quoted me on a couple of things that I was really happy to be quoted on. So I don't think it's me talking flirtatiously. I think it's the 10th Circuit talking flirtatiously to me. And then later on, the 9th Circuit actually adopted this language and incorporated it in a different opinion. So I will take those flirtatious things and move on with that. There's really nothing else to say about this case. And that's Baby Yoda, by the way. And Indian people love Baby Yoda so much. All right, let's go back to the cops. Like I said, this isn't going to make any sense in terms of any kind of structure or order or chronology, but here we are. Another comic book that I did in June of 2020, sort of at the heart of the thing at the beginning of the whole resuscitation of Black Lives Matter, defund the police. This is me talking back on a book that I had bought many years ago, not many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. The book by people from UNM. I can't remember which one of these guys is from the University of New Mexico, Korea, perhaps. Wrote this book called Police a Field Guide. And I thought it would be a really fun and interesting scholarly program to take this book, which is a kind of a polemic, kind of a very strongly worded attack and very extremely organized attack on the police, and just takes US Supreme Court opinions and annotate the thing. And I was unsurprised whatsoever to find that if you just take random lines from this book and type them into Westlaw, you will find a court that says exactly what these guys say that the police do. And I did go through the whole thing. I mean, this isn't really my area, but I did start putting together a paper on this, and also decided to write a list of things that I should probably go back and read someday. This is me talking back. Here's another one about that case, the McGirt versus Oklahoma case. This is one of the things I love to do in my classes particularly, but also just in some of the scholarly work I do, what we facetiously refer to as historical gossip. So this is me gossiping. I love to read The Onion. I think it's got a lot of great stuff in it. The jokes that they make about Supreme Court and about police and about the death penalty and about mass shootings are all just, I mean, it's all humor, but it's basically they're just repeating our lives back at us. So this one was based on a sort of inspired by an article in the Onion called How a Case Gets to the Supreme Court. This is how an Indian law case gets to the Supreme Court. It's happening right now as we speak. It's been a year since McGirt almost. McGirt, by the way, just to let you know what it is, it's about this guy who was on death row and another guy who was literally sentenced by an Oklahoma jury to 1,000 years in jail. Not death row, but 1,000 years in jail, as if. Both of these guys are Indians, and they were prosecuted by the state of Oklahoma inside of Indian country. And did I not just tell you that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over Indian country felonies? Well, yeah, but Oklahoma for the past 100 years, with the federal government's acquiescence, has continued to prosecute cases within reservation boundaries in Oklahoma, asserting without any authority whatsoever all this time that those reservations no longer exist. Well, it turns out, according to the Supreme Court 2020, those reservation boundaries do exist. So Oklahoma's argument at the Supreme Court was basically, actually, do I have a picture of that? I was going to use that. They put in a brief, a picture of the skyline of Tulsa, and said to the Supreme Court, does this look like Indian country to you? No Indians would live in a high-rise building like this. And, you know, they sort of got dinged for that, you know, that kind of thinly veiled overt racism doesn't even go well in front of a fairly conservative Supreme Court. There's a lot of ellipses in between what I just said, so you can read between the lines there. But this is me explaining how a case in Indian law gets to the Supreme Court. There's a lot of allegations by non-Indians and non-Indian governments that if Indians win a case, it'll be the end of America. And turns out it's only the end of Oklahoma, and I'm good with that because Oklahoma can go to hell, but that's just me. I don't really like Oklahoma. Moving on. Here's the stuff I was talking to you about Chmukman political theory. Did I tell you that there's no rhyme or reason or actual structure to this? But to reiterate, you know, Chmukman political theory is all about scaring people into submission. And if they can't be scared into submission, just force them into submission. And it's amazing if you look at drawing from that book on the police manual I showed you before, or the handbook on police, you know, looking at Supreme Court opinions, how very overt and honest they are about what the purposes of police are. And one of the reasons I put this slide together is because the states, and to help you give you some context, that short slide I did earlier with Baby Yoda on it, where the courts are talking about how great tribal courts actually do. Tribal courts provide due process to people. They take people's civil rights seriously. Tribal court judges tend to be selected by tribal elected officials. Tribal court judges tend to be civil rights lawyers and advocates. They tend to be people of color, people with diverse sexual orientation and gender identity. They tend to be incredible slices of American life in a way that federal and state judiciaries are jokingly, laughingly not. And we get some really amazing opinions. It's like an alternate universe of what, you know, America could look like if people took, if our government took seriously notions of equality and diversity and rights. That said, tribal police are just as bad as all the other police. The federal government often funds tribal governments and imposes obligations on tribal governments to behave like state and federal governments. And where that comes out the most is in the policing. If you're going to be cross-deputized with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate federal crimes alongside with the federal government, your police have to be trained by either the BIA or at a police academy in the state in which the tribe is located. And if you want to be cross-deputized to enter into cooperative agreements with state and local governments, same exact thing. Our police are the exact same kind of police that walk around town dressed up as stormtroopers and drive around in tanks, and armed with multiple lethal weapons on their bodies at any given moment. Tribal police are exactly the same thing. So total disconnect there that's surreal and really quite jarring. And when you look at the data that suggests that Indian people, Black and Indigenous people, but Indian people in particular, are actually shot and killed. Unarmed Indian people are shot and killed at a higher percentage and rate than any other demographic. I know the N is a lot smaller, but it's still the higher rate. A lot of those shootings are from the tribal police. Tribal citizens who are often the police are the cops themselves doing that. And I'm still trying to figure out how to assess that as a scholar. So this is me talking angrily. And this is sort of the last substantive thing where this is about the pandemic. And when this pandemic started, my mother immediately mentioned to me, she doesn't usually dictate to me what my scholarly agenda is about, but all she had to do was say, you know how many of our relatives died in the flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919? And I had heard about that, but we don't talk about the people who have walked out often. And it was a moment that all I had to hear was that. I don't need to go back and investigate my own family because I can investigate other people's families. And this is actually part of it works better as a 2-slide thing. The first slide is from 1918, and I'm sorry I didn't include it. It's a self-congratulatory article from the United States Public Health Service, and that division is now known as the Indian Health Service for our purposes, where a guy named Dr. Gregory Shittles was talking about how it just seems like the pandemic, the first wave, they didn't know it was the first wave then in 1918, it sort of skipped over Indian country, and it turns out they really weren't affected by it. Well, that was a flat out lie. And then the second wave came in 1919, killed a bunch more people. And that's where the federal government sort of admitted, yeah, there were some people who died. And they said 6,000 Indian people between 1918 and 1919. A few years ago, somebody did some more research on that, concluded it was more like 30 or 40,000 Native people. Remember in 1910, you don't remember this, in 1910, there were only 100,000 people in the US who were Indians. That's the lowest population figure we reached during this whole 500-year period of colonialism. And just a few years later, that many, as 20% of Indian people were killed by the pandemic. The death rate that the government was willing to admit for every Indian person who was infected was 9%, which was about 3 or 4 times higher than any other demographic. And that's what we were looking at the beginning of the pandemic, a repeat of that. And it started to look like that was the case. And luckily, in many places in Indian country, it was not. And not to be proud or snooty, but my communities were the first communities to be truly serious about being vaccinated, and were vaccinated. I've been vaccinated for quite a while now. A lot of my relatives were vaccinated by the first week of January this year. And that's because of one of the very few successes of tribal self-governance in conjunction with the federal government helping us out. When we're on our own, we do a lot better. There's some books that I wrote. And this is the last slide, just to remind everybody that I know a little bit of Emily and Janine's secrets, and that they can't hold anything over me. And Emily's not in the picture below. Unfortunately, she wasn't in volume 2, but this is a quote from her, where it says in the middle, laughter, I assume that's me. And other than that, thank you so much. If you wanted to see more of the comic book, I realize it's not the easiest thing to see. I will put a link to it in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. It is incredible to see the work that you've been doing in this form. I just think it's so extraordinary. And there are some questions, but before I get to them, there is actually, Matthew, a question for you specifically from Professor Dungel. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name. And who asked, if you could please give a brief explanation of the legal system of the Native Americans on the reservations.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, within Indian country or Indian reservations, there's a lot of overlap there. The main government is our Indian tribes themselves. They receive some funding from the federal government. They generate their own funding through various enterprises. In a lot of ways, Indian tribes are federal government contractors. The United States through the treaty process, has agreed to take Indian tribes under its protection. So there's a duty of protection that we sometimes call the trust responsibility, where the federal government funds us. Really what the federal government does is delegate federal powers to tribes and some funding, not enough, to really to run reservations, to govern reservations. And tribes take the funding and do, their version of self-governance, but really they do it under the sort of the thumb, and that's not a terrible thing, of the federal government. And we are federal government contractors for all practical purposes. But when it comes to criminal jurisdiction, the feds reserve to themselves and often delegate to states the power to prosecute non-members of the tribe. So Indians are prosecuted by the tribes generally, but felonies, as I said before, are all handled by the federal government. And there's sort of a mix in some states and some places of state criminal jurisdiction as well. I hope that's helpful.
Certainly helpful to me. So before I ask for the first audience question, I'm actually wondering if any of you, the three of you, have questions for each other, or want to talk to each other about the work that you've just presented. I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but in keeping with our sort of conversational ethos.
Well, Manuel, I'll start. I loved your just your talk about the year 1492. There are things in that presentation that I was unaware of. Christopher Columbus having to leave from a dumpy shipping route because everything else was clogged with this horrible forced migration, and just had no idea. I have a great friend who is a bookseller. And he's been trying to find books on the Salem witch trials. This is a totally different point. To give to another friend of mine who's a law prof at Michigan who's writing a book on the Salem witch trials. And I can't wait to show them that that thing from the conversation about how women were brewing the beer until the whole and became too competitive, so they were labeled witches. I think that's a really important thing to point out to those guys. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may answer, I was thinking, as Emily pointed out already during Janine's presentation, that there's a connection there between the historical context that I was presenting and then how that carries over into the present. Not necessarily carries over, but it's constantly reinvented and reproduced. And when you were talking, I thought this is another instance of precisely the kind of thinking that was then applied to what was then called Indigenous peoples. But then, of course, the very category of Indigenous is another construction that glosses over very many differences and self-identifications, which itself is a colonial move. So having to work from within that identification is itself colonial. So how do you speak against that? And I think appropriating a different means of entering the conversation, as you do, is very subversive. So I learned a lot too.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to say to Janine that I was glad that she is continuing this work that she's been doing since we knew her in law school. And, it's like, Indian law, it never really goes away, and there's always something to say. It always mutates and forms into something else, but in the end, it's just the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, Matt was my first note editor. And I was writing about police. So he's
right.
seen the evolution of this.
So cool. So let me read the first question. So this question is from Zamira Saidi, who is a second year JD student actually at Cincinnati Law. And she asks, when we speak about belonging in a sense that white people are looking for their roots, as one of the speakers mentioned before, I think it was Manuela, that one of the reasons for starting this movement was that people of German descent felt that Muslimization of Germany is destroying their roots. My question is, how much could this movement raise sort of immigrant hate crime, that people will start hating and hitting immigrants while they're already in a vulnerable situation. And I think that's so, you know, just in terms of what we've been saying very recently here in the United States and elsewhere, a really good question, I think.
But I think it's directed to a comment made by Tiffany in the keynotes panel.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, if any of you would like to answer, please feel free.
I'll say something about this. From a hate crime perspective, we're not going to get a sense of increases in hate crime ever until we start accounting for the number of hate crimes that are actually happening. And we are so bad at getting a handle on hate crimes that we can't even say anything about increases. So for instance, the many who track hate crimes against Asian Americans, Asians, Pacific Islanders say, oh, there's this recent increase in the number. We never tracked how many there were before. So, you know, there's more publicity surrounding them, sure. But before, as a hate crime scholar, I'm going to say that there is an increase, I need to be clear about how many there actually are.
So I'm actually, as a follow-up to that, Janine, so what are who is keeping track of these things? And to what extent is it happening?
I mean, it's really, I mean, I've been studying this for 25 years and we're in a worse place now than we were when I started, sadly, which is incredible, really, right? Because you look at legislative changes, you know, almost all states have hate crime legislation. You know, there's been a huge increase in the number of police departments reporting. Still 86.1% of police departments say that there were 0 hate crimes in their jurisdiction. So, you know, that's not an improvement. It's terrible. So there are a couple of different measures. Advocacy groups keep measures. Advocacy group numbers are really different than the police numbers because advocacy groups, of course, don't investigate, like to see whether it fits the statute, et cetera. Police numbers, you know, also terrible. You know, most of the police departments in the country are undercounting, that report are undercounting. And then their victim surveys. So those are the most accurate surveys. Federal National Victimization Survey, and that suggests that there are hundreds of thousands of hate crimes every year. So.
Right. If that, I mean, if that's might be very conservative.
Right. Yes.
Right. So thank you. Actually, so we had an anonymous question that came up during a little earlier that for Manuela specifically that she answered sort of in the Q&A, but I'd like to ask it anyway because I think it's a really good question. You gave a really good answer. So the question is, first of all, many thanks for the talks. And goes on, there's a lot packed into 1492 that later came to signify the categorization of humanity, as Manuela neatly sets out. The events of 1492 are often associated with the West. I wonder whether Manuela has any thoughts on whether these events are similarly or differently applicable to Central and Eastern Europe, a region that is often presented with colonial exceptionalism. Great question.
So I think it's wonderful to have an opportunity to discuss this as a methodological question as well, because what we think about when we talk about similarities and differences is how we compare regions, but the comparison put like that would tend to suggest that these regions are somehow separate or that they can be thought of as separate. And so that's why I said the question is important, but the short answer would be that events associated with 1492 and the production of difference are neither similarly nor differently applicable to Central and Eastern Europe because they're interconnected with events in the West. So the fact that there was a European colonial expansion opened opportunities for migration and employment for many Eastern Europeans, and a lot of them were Jews from Eastern Europe that migrated to the US. That doesn't mean that the migration process was unproblematic, but there were employment opportunities that were opened up because of colonization. And at the same time, the colonization going out from the west of Europe led to peripheralizing Eastern Europe as a mere agricultural supplier to the West that had less resources. And at the same time, in the region, in Central and Eastern Europe, there were what historians have tended to call for a long time pre-modern empires that were very much still modern, very much kind of producing very modern types of difference. The Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, they continue to exercise dominance in the region long after 1492, right? And they have their own colonial ambitions. Certainly Austria-Hungary had, but also the Ottoman Empire up until the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century in Egypt, very much kind of intervening as a colonial power. And for that, if I had had more time, I would have introduced the concept of inter-imperiality that Laura Doyle uses, and she has a recent book on it, in order to point precisely to the fact that coloniality draws our attention to the westward colonial expansion of Europe, but that was not the only colonial or imperial expansion at the same time. We very much had the dominance of empires in Central and Eastern Europe that was a trigger and a generator of difference in its own right. And for that, I mean, the one kind of clear moment that we need to associate with that is that the parallel enslavement of the Roma in Wallachia and Moldavia and today's Romania was a 500-year enslavement process as well that was very much related to a racialization connected to religion and very much driven by the Orthodox Church as well as the state. And I guess, especially since today is International Roma Day, this needs to be flagged, at least. I'll stop here, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you for flagging that for us too as well, Manuela. So we're getting close to time, but we started a little bit late. So I'm actually going to ask two more questions or do two more questions. And I'll give the last question to Kristen, who I'll just unmute her and she can ask it after this. So this question comes from an anonymous attendee. If self-determination of identity is in and of itself a colonial process, I agree. Would analyzing the marginalization of queers in a similar and concurrent fashion be helpful or useful? Or would such an analysis only serve to detract from a colonial analysis rooted in race? Oh, what a great question.
You know, can you hear me? I was
yes.
My earbud cut off. So I have sort of I'm curious about the question, and I'm not sure that I'm able to answer it, but I think in Indian law and Native people are often confronted with people trying to be us. And this is a particularly important point in higher education with what we actually were named for it called box checkers. And that's not unique to Indian people, but there's a lot of people that I went to law school with who checked the box. And, you know, our law school administration told me there were 7 Indian people in our section. And I know pretty sure that there was one, that was me, and some other people who checked the box. And this has just consequences for people. But law schools, other schools really depend heavily on this self-identification. for purposes of saying, well, we got all these, we have so much diversity here. And this runs the gamut up and down. And it's becoming harder and harder to do that. Indian people, in a way that is a little bit creepy for what's going on. But I'm not sure that that translates in the same way to other communities, right? I think self-identification personally, I'm cisgender, regular heteronormative guy. I don't know how regular that is, but that identification is perfectly unique and self-identification is critically important and should be respected, justified. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it does. That's my reaction to it, and I think I don't know how it runs across the board and translates all the way across. And not speaking in the most accurate way or eloquent way, but that's sort of what my thought was.
Does anyone else want to answer the question? If not, I can ask Kristen to unmute and ask her question.
I want to say something about
Okay.
box checking and African Americans. I wrote an article several years ago that suggested we should, for African Americans, we need to expand the box because of box checkers. We need to have a very detailed box, right? So you didn't just get to check the box. If you checked it, you had to say how or you were actually Black, right? Give us a little, fill this in a little bit. It was, this is really a problem in the African American community, right? Really a problem. So.
Can I add something?
Of course.
Because when I listen to all of you reacting, I'm thinking of the box that is in all of our heads when we think in categories that have already been set out from a particular perspective and from the very notion of Indianness coming from the fact that Columbus got lost. And he wanted to arrive in India and thought had arrived in India and died thinking he had arrived in India. And from there, we still have the Indian and Indio for South America, as well as the West Indies up until today. But this is actually a geographical error that has become prominent, has achieved, I don't know, Hollywood status, but it doesn't translate in any way to social reality. So it is a way that this is maybe the most ancient one, but then we have Latino being applied to Spanish people because it has been, it seeped into law in disrespect to historical and social reality. So I think I am a firm believer in the power of education. So I think if we become more aware of the historical roots of many of our pervasive stereotypes and categories, then we might find a different language. And I think language is in itself powerful. It doesn't solve anything yet, but it's a different way of having agency. And I think Matthew's way of putting language in a very different box through the comic book and kind of wresting political agency away from academic discourse, putting it into a different format is one way of kind of using language in a very creative form. So thank you.
That's a great point. And it reminds me of the conversation that Tiffany and Natsu and Sunny were having about sort of intersectionality towards the end of their talk. But Kristen, why don't you unmute and you can have the last question.
Okay, well, I want to end us on time, so I'm going to follow up with Janine later on my own question. And I don't even want to go after Manuela because that was such a good summation, but it was related to what my comment that I was going to make, which was also just how exciting it is to see the synergies between when you read your bios and you're on the same panel. It's like, wow, this is really interesting, but the whole idea was to bring scholars who work in different areas together under this umbrella of belonging and difference. And I think that Matthew's drawing attention to the words we have for how we talk about things also just fits so well. I mean, Native people's languages have so many subtleties to the language itself. And if you have 20 different words to express a certain idea, that shows the importances and the nuances. And I think that really nothing else could have drawn out what we're hoping comes out of this conversation. When Sunny first threw out the word belonging, Emily and I jumped on that because belonging is not necessarily that frequently used in the legal context to talk about these kind of terms. And it just seemed like a really rich place to bring this group together. So thank you all. This is just so exciting, and we're only halfway done. So
thank you, Kristen, for that excellent wrap-up comment. And I want to thank the three of you for a great conversation. I also was reminded to correct something that I said earlier in terms of surveys about the webinar. A link will actually be sent to all attendees and participants afterwards, so you can fill that out after. So just want to remind you all of that. And with that said, I think we can break for lunch now, and then we will reconvene at 1:30. Is that right? Yes, 1 o'clock?
Yeah.
1 o'clock. I'm so sorry. So we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock, and thank you very much.
All right. So good to see you all. Thanks for the invite. It was
Great to
fun.
see you.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Talk to you later someday. All right. Take it easy.
You too.